It has been about 3 weeks since the death of George Floyd, which took place in Minneapolis and has sparked a response around the world. On May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. The incident was recorded and the video made public. In response to the brutal nature in which George was killed, the people of Minneapolis and eventually every state, as well as multiple countries, have protested against the violence police use, in particular toward Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. The global protestings indicate that George's death is not an isolated incident, and that police use of force and violence is a problem for millions of people around the world. To focus more locally, a New York Times article states that the police in Minneapolis used force against Black people at a rate at least 7 times that of white people during the last 5 years. An article from 2016 reports that in Minnesota, white drivers are less likely to be searched when they're pulled over, even though they are more likely to have contraband. Each of these statistics indicate more violent police encounters and a higher rate of incarceration for Black people compared to white people. Since George Floyd's death and the ensuing global response, the city of Minneapolis is considering reallocating funds from the police department to develop safer, community-based programs to support and protect its citizens.
Mental Health Resources as an agency is committed to continuing to work toward racial equity. What that means is that we recognize that the systems in place have been unfair and off balance, and we are working to make sure that resources and opportunities are more fairly offered and distributed. We do not tolerate racism. However, we acknowledge that it exists and are actively taking steps to work against it. MHR has been focused and proactively working on racial equity for several years. Many staff were involved in an extensive training on racism and racial equity that gave us additional tools to use as an agency to recognize and address racism. There are monthly lunch and learn discussions focused on different topics related to racism. We have taken steps to hire, retain, and promote more staff of color within the agency, and we have an equity and inclusion committee that meets regularly. At the CSP, we had a racial equity task force, have talked about disparities in housing and accessing mental health services as a team and with members, and have made a point to order from and support Black-owned businesses. Recently, our new executive director appointed 3 new board members to the MHR board, all people of color and one with lived experience of mental illness. We are continuing to diversify our agency's staff, leadership, and board to mirror the population that we serve. We will be putting an anti-racism statement on our website and our intake materials, and will continue to use a racial equity lens when reviewing, creating, or rewriting agency policy and procedure in order to identify structural racism and right those wrongs. At the CSP, we will continue to work on recognizing racism, disparities, and injustice, and then to talk about how to work against that with each other and with our members. We always welcome feedback and suggestions on ways that we can be doing this better. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us in any way that feels comfortable to you to share your thoughts and opinions.
A lot of us, especially white folks, are asking ourselves right now, how can we be more involved and informed and actively anti-racist? Activism and action can look like a lot of things. We can read, listen, consume perspectives and information about white privilege, systemic racism, and Black and Indigenous and people of color stories. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Be mindful of ways to engage in influencing personal and systemic change in sustainable ways. If nonfiction and hard facts feel exhausting at times, in order to practice self-care and support yourself through this process, discover Black artists and novelists, to consume art and fiction that centers Black experiences and voices. Changing the media and art we consume can influence unlearning white-centric narratives within ourselves. Let's talk about ideas for action steps. Look at ways to access things you buy on a regular basis from organizations that are Black or Indigenous or people of color owned, or places that don't fund the politics and systems that perpetuate racism and anti-Blackness. For example, you could Google companies that support anti-racism or Black Lives Matter or Black-owned businesses in Minneapolis. If you engage with social media, you can highlight Black leaders and voices, challenge yourself to have conversations with people in your life about race, racism, and white privilege. If you are able, you can donate your time and resources, engage in political activism that supports anti-racist policy. Activism can look like so many different things. Take a look in the details below the video for some places to start.
large majority of folks that we serve were heavily impacted by the events that followed George Floyd's murder. Some places will need to rebuild, which takes time. During that time, folks will be without restaurants, homes, grocery stores, convenience stores, etc. in their community. We reached out to the community partners and they responded. We know that during this time, it can cause a lot of stress and anxiety to think where you might find your next meal or hygiene product. So we are offering a food shelf-like services at the CSP for members and those who receive services through mental health resources. All you have to do is come to the CSP and request the items that you need. We will put them in a bag and you can be on your way. If you can't get to the CSP, please reach out to your CSP counselor so that we can figure out a way to get you the items that you need. During this time, it can be really challenging to process the events that have occurred. And we want to make sure that you all know that we want to provide a safe space for these emotions that you are feeling. Please connect with your CSP counselor and check in with us. We want to hear from you.
We as individuals, as a community, and as a country are undoubtedly experiencing hard times. We know that this is an especially tough time for Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other communities of color. However, hardship is something that is not new to these communities. They are faced with the realities and violence of racism each and every day. This should also be a tough time for white people. We don't get a pass this time. If it's not hard and we aren't uncomfortable, then we are not doing the work. We're not showing up as allies to individuals and communities who continue to suffer. What do I mean by that? Looking inward, examining our whiteness and our role in perpetuating white supremacy is not easy. It doesn't feel good, and it can bring up a lot of emotion. That is normal. That is encouraged. Change doesn't happen without being uncomfortable and taking conscious action to challenge the status quo. I want to tell you all that this work can be done, and it is worth it. As a white person who grew up in the predominantly white state of Montana, as many of you know, I have had to do a lot of work, and I've had a lot more work to do in challenging the narrative and privilege that has been ingrained in me since birth. I have a lot of work to do also in challenging the narrative in the people around me as well, to open their hearts and minds to the ideas of anti-racism and ways to take action. So I'm encouraging you all, I'm challenging you all, please join me and the CSP community in this work.
We know that more than half of the people that police use force and violence against are people living with mental illness. Many of you have survived or witnessed these sorts of experiences. Especially for our members who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we understand that George Floyd's murder and the news coverage and uprising that has happened in our city and country since then may be triggering traumatic memories from our own histories and those of people you care about.
You may be noticing grief and anger, difficulty sleeping and eating, wanting to withdraw from people and activities, or wanting to connect and talk more than usual, but finding that those around you don't know what to say or how to support you. You might be feeling on high alert for dangers and generally not feeling safe. This is to be expected. Finding ways to be gentle and compassionate with yourself and seeking out safe people to talk to can help with healing from the grief, anger, and trauma caused by the far-reaching impacts of racism. Being Black, Native, or a person of color living in this city and country is traumatizing. We want to encourage you to use the CSP staff for support and referrals to anti-racism or trauma-informed therapists and healers.
The Mary Ellen Strong Foundation has a helpful directory of Black psychotherapists. The Vona Center for Mental Health has services specific to Somali and East African folks. The Indian Health Board has counselors who integrate traditional and native cultural practices into their mental health services. We are here to talk and help you find the supports that you need for healing.
White folks, you may be noticing that you're not sure what your role is in getting rid of racism. You may notice that you're thinking more about the privileges you have had as white people, but not know what you can do to make our city and country a more just and safe place for our Black neighbors, Native neighbors, and neighbors of color. We know that as people who have experienced oppression and trauma because of your mental health status, you have empathy for others experiencing oppression and want to be part of making things better. It is important that we use this opportunity to educate ourselves, to learn and listen, and to be active in changing ourselves and using our voices and experiences.
The CSP has a racial equity task force, and we invite you to join. The CSP staff can refer you to reading and film materials that can help you in your journey towards unlearning racism. There's so many ways that we as white people need to be doing this work together, so let's keep talking.